Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
It was a Sunday night in America, March 31st, 1968. Families had settled in for the evening. Ed Sullivan, Bonanza, the kind of television that made the chaos of the era feel, just for a moment, manageable. Then the networks cut in. The president had something to say. His press office told the networks it would be about Vietnam, so the country braced for that. Whatever came next, people figured, would be more of what they'd been living through for years. Numbers, strategy, reassurances nobody quite believed anymore. For nearly 40 minutes, they got what they expected. Lyndon Johnson talked about the war, about a bombing halt, about peace, and then, without warning, without any preparation of any kind, the most powerful man on earth said something that nobody in that audience, not his vice president, not most of his senior staff, not a single reporter in Washington had expected to hear. I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. And the room went quiet. I know it went quiet because I was there, not at the White House. I was in college, sitting in the chapter room of my fraternity house, watching that speech with a large group of my brothers. We were not a quiet crowd. Until that moment, we were. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. We just sat with what had just happened, looking at each other. I think every one of us was asking the same question at the same time. What in God's name happens now? What happened next, it turns out, is a story far stranger and far darker than anything we could have imagined sitting in that silence. This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, and today I want to take you underneath that speech, not just to what Johnson said. Everyone knows what he said. I want to take you to what was happening behind it and what happened after it. Because the full story of March 31st, 1968 includes a covert political operation, intelligence intercepts, a possible act of treason, and a decision by a sitting president to stay silent about all of it. A decision that may have cost more than 20,000 American lives. And here's what fascinates me. The man at the center of this story wasn't a villain. He wasn't a simple hero either. He was something harder to hold, a genuinely complicated human being, making impossible choices under unbearable pressure. Understanding March 31st, 1968, means holding several truths at once and not letting any of them off the hook. Picture this. The White House, the afternoon of March 31st. Johnson had been awake most of the previous night. That morning, he attended Catholic Mass with his daughter Lucy. Afterward, he drove to the home of his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, to tell him privately what was coming. Humphrey wept. Back at the Oval Office, Johnson spent the afternoon going through draft after draft of his address, making edits on camera. The film still exists, grainy black and white footage of a large, exhausted man hunched over a desk, crossing out lines, writing new ones. Those final words, the words that stopped the country cold, he refused to practice. He would not speak them aloud until the moment they went out live to the nation. He told his staff he needed to preserve the option of pulling them entirely. He said afterward that if North Vietnam had launched a major offensive that afternoon, he believes he would not have made the announcement. He made it to the end of the speech. And then he said the words, "Let me build the clock for you, because what makes that moment so extraordinary is everything that built toward it." By 1968, Lyndon Johnson's presidency had become a tragedy in the classical sense. Not because he was a bad man, but because his greatest qualities had led him step by step into a situation from which there was no clean exit. This was the Johnson who pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, who created Medicare and Medicaid, who launched Head Start, who passed more consequential domestic legislation than any president since Franklin Roosevelt. His Great Society was real, not a slogan, but a genuine transformation of what the federal government owed its citizens. And this was also the man who by early 1968 had 548,000 American troops in Vietnam and had already lost 30,000 of them. His approval rating had fallen from 70% in mid-1965 to below 40 by 1967. He told Lady Bird privately, "I can't get out, I can't finish it with what I've got. So what the hell do I do?" He never found an answer he could live with. Then came Tet. On January 30th, 1968, North Vietnamese forces launched simultaneous attacks on more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns. The administration had been telling the public there was light at the end of the tunnel. Tet proved that whatever was happening over there, it wasn't that. Walter Cronkite flew to Vietnam, saw what was happening, came back, and told Americans on the evening news that the war appeared to be a stalemate. Johnson watched the broadcast and reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." He had. By early March, Senator Eugene McCarthy had nearly beaten Johnson in the New Hampshire primary, running as an anti-war candidate, and Robert Kennedy had entered the race. The president told his cabinet that the only place he could safely give a campaign speech was on an aircraft carrier. Here's what most people don't know about March 31st. The announcement wasn't sudden. Johnson had been carrying it for months. His advisors had drafted a withdrawal statement for a party dinner in October 1967. He read it and set it aside. They drafted it again for December. Again he set it aside. Again for the State of the Union in January 1968. Again he folded it away. The door was always there. He kept opening it and closing it. What finally pushed him through was the combination of Tet, the primary results, and something more personal. A series of health crises in 1967 had left him genuinely uncertain whether he could survive another 4 years. He had nearly died of a massive heart attack in 1955. He did not want to die in office, so on March 31st he did two things at once. He announced a significant, unilateral halt to the bombing of North Vietnam, a genuine de-escalation offered without conditions. And he removed himself from the political equation entirely so that Hanoi could not dismiss the offer as campaign theater. His words to an aide just past midnight after the speech: "I never was any surer of any decision I ever made in my life, and I never made a more unselfish one. I have 525,000 men whose very lives depend on what I do, and I can't worry about the primaries." The country responded. His approval rating swung from 57% disapproval to 57% approval almost overnight. Peace talks opened in Paris in May 1968. For a brief window that spring, it seemed like Johnson's sacrifice might actually end the war. Here is where the story turns dark. The Paris peace talks stalled through the summer. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu was reluctant to engage seriously. He kept finding reasons to delay, to object, to pull back from any framework that seemed within reach. Johnson's negotiating team was increasingly frustrated. What they didn't understand at first, and then learned through National Security Agency intercepts and FBI surveillance, was the reason Thieu was holding out. A woman named Anna Chenault was at the center of it. She was a prominent Republican fundraiser, a Chinese-born American with deep personal ties to the South Vietnamese government, and she was co-chair of the Republican National Finance Committee. She was also, the intercepts showed, passing messages from the Nixon campaign to Thieu's representatives. The message, conveyed through back channels: hold out. Don't agree to anything with Johnson. Nixon is going to win the election, and you will get a far better deal from him than you will ever get from the Democrats. Thieu held out. On October 31st, 1968, 4 days before the election, Johnson announced a complete halt to all U.S. bombing of North Vietnam, his most significant peace gesture yet. Humphrey's poll numbers surged. He was closing the gap with Nixon rapidly in the final days. And then, Thieu publicly announced that South Vietnam was withdrawing from the Paris peace process. The timing was devastating to Humphrey's campaign. Nixon won the presidency by less than 1 percentage point of the popular vote. Johnson knew he had the NSA intercepts, he had the FBI surveillance reports, he had the phone records. He confronted Nixon directly by telephone. Nixon denied any knowledge of Chenault's activities. Johnson did not believe him. He called it treason, not in the precise legal sense, but in the moral one. A private political operation had covertly interfered with a sitting president's ability to end an active war, a war in which Americans were dying every single day, in order to swing a presidential election. That is what happened, and Lyndon Johnson stayed quiet about it. This is the question I find I can't fully resolve, and I've sat with it for a long time. Why? The evidence suggests several reasons, none of them fully satisfying on their own. He worried that revealing NSA intercepts would expose American signals, intelligence capabilities, and burn critical sources. He worried about what a public disclosure would do to the country in the final days of a presidential election, a constitutional earthquake built on surveillance of a rival campaign. Some historians believe he feared the accusation that a Democratic president was using intelligence tools to destroy a Republican candidate, even with legitimate evidence in hand. And perhaps there was something more personal. Johnson had started the war. He had escalated it. He had told the public for years that progress was being made when the evidence was far more complicated than that. Exposing Nixon's back-channel sabotage would not undo any of that. So he stayed quiet. Nixon took office. The war continued for 7 more years. The peace agreement Nixon signed in January 1973 was, in its essential features, essentially the same framework that had been within reach in 1968. Historians estimate that more than 20,000 additional American military personnel died in the years between Nixon's election and the final withdrawal. The peace that Johnson sacrificed his presidency to achieve had been stolen from him, and he let the theft go unanswered. I respect every person for who they are. That's the principle that keeps me honest when I work through a story like this one. What it requires here is this: Lyndon Johnson cannot be reduced to a single verdict. The man who signed the Civil Rights Act was also the man who misled the American public about the war for years. The man who stepped aside on March 31st to give peace a genuine chance was also the man who, 8 months later, held the evidence of what had been done to that peace, and chose silence. Both things are true. All of it is true. There is no version of this story where he's simply the hero or the villain, because he was both and he was neither, and that's the only honest way to hold it. We're still living with the questions March 31st, 1968 raised. When does a leader's continued presence in office do more damage than his departure? How do you handle evidence of foreign policy manipulation by a political opponent when the evidence itself was obtained in ways that complicate its public use? What do we owe history and the people who died waiting for a peace that was sabotaged when we finally understand what happened? The Chennault affair remained largely unknown to the general public for decades. The full picture only emerged from declassified documents and oral histories beginning in the 1990s and early 2000s. Johnson's own senior aides confirmed the essential facts in interviews conducted long after his death in January 1973. Historians Robert Dallek and Ken Hughes both reviewed the primary source materials and reached the same conclusions. The files are there. What happened, happened. George Santayana observed that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I'd add something to that. Sometimes we remember the surface of the past and miss everything underneath it. Most Americans remember LBJ quitting. Very few know what was done to the peace he quit for. That gap between the history we think we know and the history that actually unfolded beneath it is exactly the kind of gap that costs us. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, sit with these questions. When does a leader's departure serve the country more than his staying? How do you make public something true that might shatter the very institutions you're trying to protect? And what does it mean when the person who sacrificed most for peace was ultimately the one who let its sabotage go unanswered? Because that's what March 31st, 1968 teaches us. Not just about Lyndon Johnson, but about the weight of power, the cost of silence, and the distance between the history written in textbooks and the history that actually happened in the dark. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, tell a friend. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.